drugs, or ideas, what you consume influences who you become. On the Mind and Matter podcast, we learn together from the best scientists and thinkers alive today about how your mind-body reacts to what you feed it. Before starting Mind and Matter, I spent 10 years in academia doing scientific research. I got a PhD in neuroscience where I focused on neuroendocrinology and the neurobiology of behavior, and before that, I specialized in molecular, developmental, and evolutionary genetics. I use my scientific background to help parse and translate the information that guests share on the podcast. In addition to the podcast, I write long-form written content inspired by the show where I integrate what I've learned across episodes. I also have a free weekly newsletter where I provide you with upcoming guests, share links, and provide commentary on scientific studies and research that I'm reading, and more. Visit mindandmatter.substack.com to find all of my content. The full version of this episode is available to paid subscribers at the Mind and Matter Substack at mindandmatter.substack.com. The full version is also freely available on my YouTube page. Just look up Mind and Matter or my name, Nick Jikomes, on YouTube, and you'll find the episode there. This is a partial version of the episode, and so it'll cut off partway through, but you'll still get a significant portion. So sign up to become a paid subscriber at Substack or visit my YouTube page to get the full episode. Who are you and what are you best known for?
I'm probably best known for being Terence McKenna's younger brother. I mean, honestly, and I wrote this book, the subtitle is My Life with Terence McKenna. But Terence has been gone for 23 years, which makes me, is kind of sobering when you look back on it, that it's been so long. On the other hand, he's still very much part of the cultural conversation. He's achieved this certain immortality, cyber immortality on the web. His stuff is all over YouTube, and even though a lot of that was from the mid-90s, it's still very timely, because he was a guy that was very much ahead of his time and very much focused on the future. So that's our association. But then I went on. I have had my own career in what you might call ethnopharmacology. And I've investigated ayahuasca. I conducted a biomedical... Why is that coming up? I conducted a biomedical research project on ayahuasca in the early 90s with the UDV, and my thesis my thesis work at the University of British Columbia focused on ayahuasca and another very obscure psychedelic that few people have heard of called ukuhe. More people have heard of it now because I've talked about it. It's another orally active form of DMT, but comes from completely different plant sources. And ayahuasca is made from this combination of Banisteriopsis and Psychotria viridis, chacruna. And so it's DMT potentiated by beta carbonates. And ukuhe, in my investigations, the question was, one of the central questions was, is that the same? Is it the same mechanism? Because Varola is the main ingredient of ukuhe, which is used by the Witoto, and it's a dying tradition. It's not a popular thing at all. Ayahuasca is like a global superstar now. Nobody's ever heard of ukuhe. Except a few ethnopharmacologists and like I say, other people. But anyway, Varola is used as snuff in different parts of the Amazon, primarily by the Yanomami. And the reason for that is that, snuffs don't have this issue about oral activity. They're parenterally taken. So this was interesting. Ukuhe was interesting to me when I was doing my research because it's another tryptamine-containing plant, preparation. But from completely different botanical sources. So the central sort of hypothesis, if you could call it that, of my research is it the same mechanism? In other words, there beta carbolines in ukuhe that are similar to those in ayahuasca, and is that the basis of the mechanism? And it turns out it's not so clear that it is the same. There are very few beta carbolines. There are beta carbolines in ukuhe, but very trace amounts, effectively, and yet it is orally active. So I never really did nail down why that was, but I think why it was because the tryptamines in ukuhe are basically DMT and 5-methoxy DMT, in very high amounts. So these things are, they are substrates for monoamine oxidase. But it may be that effectively they inhibit monoamine oxidase, so they do enable it to be absorbed in the, in the orally active form. That was the supposition. That was what I concluded. I don't know that people are interested in those details, but anyway, that was the finding of my research and on this. So
you're an ethnopharmacologist by profession. You're the brother of the famous or the infamous Terence McKenna, and I think many of the listeners will have some familiarity with who Terence was, but I don't think all of them will have much familiarity. So can you give a brief overview before we kind of go through your lives together in different ways of who Terence McKenna was, and what was he best known for, and when was he active when he was an adult?
Well, Terence, we are famous together for a lot of the events early in life, which are described in the book. I mean, as I was a teenager in the decade. I was born in 1950, right? So the 60s were my adolescent years. Terence was 4 years older than me, just old enough to lead me down the primrose path in many of these ways. I don't think of it that way. He introduced me to some very interesting things, and he was that much older. And in the 60s, the 60s was an era where there was a great deal of interest in psychedelics, but there was basically LSD. There was much else. Occasionally one ran across mescaline, and occasionally, very occasionally, you heard about DMT, but it was almost legendary. But Terence was pretty good at working the matrix, and so he was able to get DMT, and we were both quite fascinated by that because it seemed to be just an order of magnitude stranger than LSD, which was plenty strange, but DMT was a whole different thing, and so we were fascinated by it and wanted to look into it further. But the thing with DMT that was surprising to us, I should change my here. Never mind. Sorry. The thing that was disappointing, not exactly disappointing, but I'd say frustrating about DMT was that it's so short. Like these, like 5-methoxy and DMT, you have to smoke them. They last 15 or 20 minutes pretty much, and then they very quickly go away.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the issues that we had was we wanted to be in that place longer. We actually thought of it as another place, accurately or not. And we were frustrated because you couldn't, by the time you got into the DMT space, it was already fading. So we became interested in a longer term, some sort of we thought an orally active form of DMT might last longer and give us more time to explore that place. And at that time, in the 68, 69, 70 period, the pharmacology of ayahuasca was not really well understood. You know, it wasn't understood. It was understood that there were beta carbolines in it. It wasn't really understood that the admixture plants, the DMT admixture plants, were the important component. This was all sort of a black box at that point. You know, I mean, it was quickly elucidated around the same time, but we didn't know that at that time. So we stumbled on a paper by Richard Schultes, the famous Harvard ethnobotanist. And the title of the paper was Varola as an orally active hallucinogen. And so when we found out about this, when we found this article, we thought, aha, this is the secret. We thought of it as the secret. We thought this is what we need to go find, you know. And so that was the motivation for our decision to go to South America in 1971, looking for this ukuhe. And the reason we went to La Chorrera was because La Chorrera was the ancestral home of the Witoto people, and they were the ones that had this thing. So it was a pretty, you know, we just decided that there was nothing in our world more important than that. That's what we wanted to do. So we basically quit our jobs. Not that we had jobs.
Well, actually, Dennis, I think that's actually like a perfect teaser for where I want to go, which is exactly where you're going right now. But before we get there, I do want to back up and talk about some of your earlier years with Terence, and if you could, you know, some part of the listener base will probably not be too familiar with Terence. If you had to give someone like the 10 to 20-second elevator pitch on who Terence McKenna was, just to give them a basic idea, what would it be?
Who he was?
Yeah, what was he famous for?
Well, you know, we both became famous, or, you know, he became famous. We both became famous for, you know, this trip that we did to La Chorrera in search of these things. And then he turned that into a career as a kind of cultural commentator, philosopher, that sort of thing. And I went towards science, you know. I mean, we came back from that experience, you know, with a different perspective. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to pursue the nuts and bolts of these things. And this was what led me to go into ethnopharmacology and study botany and chemistry and all the things related to that. Terence, as a result of the experiences that we had in La Chorrera, which are described in the book, was all ready to reject science. You know, he was like saying, science will never explain this stuff, you know, the things that happen to us. It will not, science is not up to the task of explaining what happened. And I was saying, well, wait a minute, let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. You know, mm-hmm. Science can carry us a certain distance to understand that. And at the time we went to La Chorrera, we were not scientists. You know, I mean, we may have fancied that we were scientists, but we weren't really scientists. We were a couple of curious, nerdy kids from Colorado with a fascination with psychedelics, you know. And so I wanted to look at the basis of the, you know, the formulation of ukuhe and other things. Terence rejected all that and, you know, became more of a philosopher and a speculator. One of the things that, of many ideas, crazy ideas or interesting ideas that came out of La Chorrera, was his ideas about time. And he became famous for the time wave zero idea. And we wrote a book together in 1975 called The Invisible Landscape, Mind, Hallucinogens, and the I Ching. He came up with this. He had in the prolonged altered states that we had at La Chirera, which actually had nothing to do with ukuhe. Ukuhe was a false herring, a red herring, sort of. When we got to La Chirera in search of ukuhe, what we found at La Chirera was pastures full of mushrooms, which we had almost no experience with at the time, but we knew what they were, and we got into them. You've read the story, so we got into them probably a bit too much, but they quickly, we started eating them a lot daily and at substantial doses, and they quickly rearranged our priorities. In a sense, we were thinking, and we set out to look for ukuhe. When we got to La Chirera, we found psilocybe cubensis growing out of every cow pie in the pasture, practically. It was the rainy season. So we started, sorry about that. I cannot suppress that, damn it.
Oh, that's fine. I could barely hear it.
Okay. So we started eating these, and they downloaded a bunch of ideas, I guess you could say, about things we could do, a biophysical experiment. We called it the experiment at La Chirera. It wasn't really an experiment. It didn't have the kind of, it probably should be called the ritual at La Chirera more than the experience of the experiment at La Chirera. But anyway, we consumed these mushrooms in great quantities, and it downloaded a whole bunch of crazy ideas about things that we could do based on the imitation of a sound in our heads that we could hear at high doses of mushrooms. And people can read about that. I don't really want to delve into it too much because I've talked about it a lot. But you can look on the McKenna Academy website, or there are various places you can. The McKenna Academy website, we actually did a retrospective on La Chirera in 2021, so people can explore that at McKenna Academy, McKenna.academy. They can explore that. Anyway, to bring the thread back, so we came back with a lot of crazy ideas, or a lot of interesting ideas, possibly crazy as well. But one of those was Terence's ideas about time, and the idea, the ideas that he later developed into the time wave theory and this mathematical treatment of the I Ching. The kernel of those ideas came out of our experiences at La Chirera. And then he actually spent decades kind of developing and building on this idea that the time wave, as he constructed it, was really a map of the texture of time and could be used to predict the future. And the past could be laid across, and it was the presumption was that the hypothesis was that this theory described the ingression of novelty into the continuum, the idea that there are actually new things under the sun every day, that there are novel events, and this time wave described the ingression of novelty into the continuum of reality. And this idea really is borrowed in some ways, although we didn't know it in the process of learning or investigating it. We found out that Alfred North Whitehead, the 20th century philosopher, had had talked about this in his magnum opus. He wrote a lot of interesting things, but Process and Reality is his major work, and so he provided a framework for our ideas. The idea that novelty does ingress into the continuum, and what the time wave brought to that was that you could actually measure this to a certain extent. You could quantify this, and it was a fractal, and it had an end. And that was the much of the discussion subsequently over 4 decades almost was when does time end? When does the singularity, the time is a collapsing spiral? It's a fractal that actually comes to an end. And much of the discussion in sort of cultural meme sphere, where these ideas were being talked about, and there was a group called the Novelty Group. Much of the discussion is about when is time going to end? And there were, in the course of sorting out these ideas, there were various endpoints postulated. But eventually he settled on December 21st, 2012 as being the end date for the appearance of a singularity, whatever that was, and the collapse of the space-time continuum, or the transition to some other kind of state of reality. And coincidentally or not, I think it was only partly coincidentally, but it was that happened to be a very important date in the Mayan calendar. Some have said, and there was a lot of discussion about December 21st, 2012, because it's the end of a major cycle in the Mayan calendar. And it was only later that this came to light. But when that piece of data surfaced, then Terence, settled on December 21st, 2012 as the definitive end date. Of course, he did not live to see that, and we're still here. So that, in some ways, that disproved the theory. I mean, if there was ever it made a prediction and it failed spectacularly, So in that sense, maybe this speculation, well, it was obviously incorrect, at least if that was the criterion. I am not, I was always sort of a skeptic about the time wave, and we used to have lively discussions, Terence and I. You might even say arguments, but let's call them lively discussions about the nature of novelty and how does novelty manifest in the continuum, and I was and still am open to the idea that novelty does emerge in time. But he was focused on the dramatic events, and my perspective was novelty doesn't erupt into the continuum. It leaks into the continuum. It's a slow process which you don't even notice generally until something happens that's definitely novel. And one of the examples of this is the first detonation of the atomic bomb. Terence said, well, that was a novel event for sure, and it was a novel event. But there was a whole series of novel events that no one noticed that led up to that. Einstein's theories of relativity, all the work that was done on nuclear fission and at Chicago by Oppenheimer and others, all of these laid the groundwork for the for the technology that led to the atomic bomb. So when the atomic bomb was eventually detonated, yes, that was very novel, but there was a bunch of things that had to happen that to make that possible. So this was the crux of the difference in our perspective on it. And but in the end, this eruptive novel event that was projected for December 21st, 2012, didn't happen. Obviously, we're still here, so the space-time continuum or whatever singularity was supposed to happen did not, or it happened and nobody noticed, which is unlikely. But so that was kind of the test of the novelty theory, and it failed in that respect. That said, though, it was a very interesting sort of mathematical construct that could be, applied to history. The trick was the problem was with the time wave was perpetually, if it has an end, where do you put the end point? How to get an accurate overlay of historical events and even cosmic events, because the time wave really in its larger cycles went back to the birth of the universe. But how do you accurately lay it across the span of time of known events? And Terence's approach to this was to identify these significant historical events, like the detonation of the atomic bomb or the collapse of, Roman civilization, or whatever it might be, these very impactful events. In the end, one of the problems that I had with the time wave, which maybe I'm getting into the weeds too far on this. You can
I think going too far. I think so you guys went to La Ferrera and you had these incredible experiences with probably more magic mushrooms than almost anyone on earth has ever taken. And I'm actually curious. And so your book, so that's a lot of that stuff is talked about in that book that you mentioned, The Invisible Landscape, which you guys wrote way back in the day. You have this new book called The Brotherhood of the Screaming Abyss, which is about your entire life with Terence.
Right.
And, one of the things that actually caught my attention in the book that you mentioned before you even got to the La Ferrera stuff is you were talking about DMT, and you said in some ways that DMT is what the book is all about. And I'm curious, when did you and Terence first encounter DMT, and what was sort of the set and setting for that? When did it happen? Where did it happen? And how did that influence you?
Yeah. So Terence was Terence finished his last 2 years of high school in the Bay Area in Menlo Park. And he fell in with a group of what you might say ultra nerds in a certain way, very intelligent but very weird people, which is exactly what he went out there for. He wanted to connect with strange ideas and was fascinated with psychedelics. Anyway, through some of the people that he knew in high school and then shortly after high school in Menlo Park, he was able to find DMT. Actually, Stanford Research Institute was doing experiments with DMT at that time. And one of his close friends had some connections to Stanford Research Institute and was able to, boost some DMT from their research lab. And then Terence tried that and said, "My God, this is more than a psychedelic. This is like the ultimate metaphysical reality, pill or whatever. It's not a pill, but this is about opening portals to other dimensions, and And I, being the little brother, I was brought along to this a few years later. He shared it with me. And it's probably worth mentioning that both Terence and I, in our adolescent years, we were very much immersed in science fiction, and science fiction more than spirituality or fascination with ethnographic practices, shamanism, and all that. And we read about all those things. But our framework was really born out of science fiction. And we actually thought of the places, the DMT state, as another dimension, another place, and that DMT opened up and that you could actually go. This was the basis of our wish to be able to spend more time there so that we could actually explore this dimension a little more. And so that was our fascination with it, that this was, LSD was interesting, but LSD was nothing compared to DMT at the time in our estimation. So this was the motivation of our desire to find a more sustained form of DMT. And the thing is, when we got to La Churera, we had come for ukuhe, but then the mushrooms were there, and in some ways, the mushrooms are the perfect orally active form of DMT. Psilocybin and psilocin. Psilocin is the active ingredient of psilocybin is converted to psilocin in the body. It's psilocin that interacts with the receptors, and psilocin chemically is very close to DMT. It's 4-hydroxy dimethyltryptamine. That trivial molecular difference makes it orally active. And at high doses, the psilocybin state is a lot like DMT. I mean, that's because it's the same dimension, if you want to put it that way. And again, we were thinking of these things in terms of a dimension, but let's call it the tryptamine space. A lot of these things, DMT, 5-methoxy DMT, it turns out, also 5-hydroxy DMT or bufotenine. All of these have a very similar phenomenology, and so you could say that they open up the tryptamine space, this family of chemicals, because they all interact similarly with the 5-HT2A receptors, which are the target for all of these true psychedelics, what I call true psychedelics. Those are the key, that's the key serotonin receptor subtype that all the true psychedelics interact with. And the tryptamines are, they all do that, and the experiences are similar with all of them. So anyway, psilocybin, if you want to study the tryptamine space, it's almost the ideal tool, because it does last hours instead of minutes. It's very non-toxic. It's very compatible with human metabolism. And, it's a kick-ass psychedelic. And it's at high doses, it can be, quite overwhelming. But it's not threatening to metabolism. Our bodies really have evolved to handle molecules like this.
Yeah.
And
How much,
as you well know, DMT, methoxy, they occur in the brain as well. So,
when you and Terence were taking like the highest doses of psilocybin mushrooms that you took, if it was at La Churera or anywhere else, how much do you estimate you were taking per dose, and what was the phenomenology like?
Well, it was very hard to say because these were fresh mushrooms. These were growing in the pasture. We weren't drying them. is hard to say, but I would say,
But if like a standard, say, recreational dose today is on the order of half of an eighth of an ounce of dried mushrooms, are you double that, or are you well above that?
well, Terence always talked about 5 dried grams as the heroic dose. That
Mhm.
was his estimate of the heroic dose. It's a pretty strong dose. There are people now that take even more than that, and I think it's uh, it's a testimony to the lack of toxicity of psilocybin, that you can pretty much increase the dose to higher levels. I mean, I know people who have taken, 10, 15, 20 grams, dried grams of
Wow.
psilocybin, or even more. I think that at a certain point, you reach a place where the whole receptor system is probably saturated,
Mm.
and you take more, but you
Mhm.
don't get more effect
But
at a
but you
certain
would have been
point.
taking more than like a 5 dried gram heroic dose, you think?
At La Chirera, I
Yeah.
would say so. I mean, I don't know what it was, but if there's a roughly 1 to 10 ratio, and 10 wet grams is about equivalent to 1 dried gram, roughly. I mean, it's 90% water,
Hmm.
and so I think these doses were probably in the 10 to 15 dried gram level. They were sufficient. Let's put it that way. They were definitely sufficient. They did the trick.
And what was the experience like?
Well, the experience was, what we focused on in this state and in this special place was that these very high doses, we could hear a sound inside our heads that we could listen to, and it wasn't clear where it came from. It was kind of like an electrical buzzing kind of sound, and something that you experience on DMT sometimes. Terence once characterized it as crackling cellophane, and it was something like that. And this sound would show up at these high doses, and we found that we could imitate this sound. We could actually try to sing the sound. And at a certain, if you could reach a point where you could just lock in on this sound, it was hard to imitate, but once you locked in on it, it would just sort of pour out of you, and you couldn't really stop it. And there seemed to be a visual, strong synesthesia effect. I mean, you made the sound, but you could see the sound at the same time. You could see something, and this is common with psychedelics, particularly with psilocybin, synesthesia. But we could actually project the sound and see apparently a visual representation of it. So that a visual component, and that got us speculating about all the things we talked about in the book about hyper translinguistic matter and all this, that we could actually use the sound as a kind of energy wave to manifest our vision on the in 3D space, so that anybody could see this. You didn't have to be on mushrooms to see it. At least that's what we thought. And so that experience with the sound and imitating the sound, and then the mushroom at this point, I mean, you've dragged me into talking about this, even though I don't want to go into details, but the mushroom got us into a place. There was a very strong noetic component to the experiences, a sense of being in touch with a non-human intelligence, whether it was the mushrooms or something channeling through the mushrooms. It was downloading all this information. about this experiment that we could do, that if you make this sound in the right circumstances, you can set up, you can do what's effectively a transformation of your own DNA. You can set up a resonance with your own DNA and produce an object, a physical object that was made out of matter and mind, so affecting this union of matter and mind, so that you could create an object that was, that you could see it and be it at the same time. And this is, there are analogies to this in occult literature, alchemical literature, particularly. The Philosopher's Stone is very much that idea, or the idea of the scrying mirror, or, there is in the sort of esoteric occult traditions, the, allusions to an artifact that you can create. And and if you could create an artifact like that, it would be pretty much the ultimate artifact. At least this is what was being transmitted to us at La Chirera. You make this thing, and it's capable of doing anything that you can imagine, literally anything that you can imagine. So that's what we were shooting for. And when it didn't happen, and it didn't happen because for a number of reasons. It didn't happen, or we wouldn't be having this conversation. And it didn't happen because it couldn't happen. It would have had to overturn pretty much every physical law that we know about. And physics is very stubborn about its laws. We were not concerned with that at that time. I mean, in fact, that was the whole idea, was that, if we can create this thing, it will basically disrupt history. It will be the end of history. It will be the ultimate artifact that brings history to an end. And then we transition into some kind of post-historical, mode of existence. And the idea was, the framework for the experiment was based on alchemy primarily. These different stages of alchemy having to do with condensing the stone, through different stages. The idea was that once condensed, you'd actually be able to hold it in your hand or look at it or whatever. And yet it would be a combination of mind and matter. It would be a fusion of mind and matter. And it would respond to thought, and it would be able to do anything that you imagined. We can talk about, there was obviously all kinds of ego inflation and messianic ideation and all this stuff, going on, which I write about in the book. We were clearly, to put it charitably, we were around the bend. We were, deluded, but they didn't really understand that at the time. It took a long time to understand that. One of the conundrums about the experiment at La Chirera was we performed the experiment, and the experiment predicted that this would happen, at the end of imitating this sound on high doses of mushrooms. Well, we did that. We performed this ritual, singing to the mushroom and trying to get this resonance, this superconducting standing waveform made of DNA, our own DMT DNA and the mushrooms, to get that to manifest. Well, that didn't happen, so then maybe, what happened then was it did not condense on schedule, So we thought, well, we've succeeded because there were different anomalous things going on that led us to think that we'd succeeded. But the question then became, we've condensed the stone, but the stone has not, it's a question of when will it show up? When is it actually going to manifest? And actually, for decades, that became the question. That had to do with the time wave and the ideas about when is this singularity going to manifest. So in some ways, my brother's preoccupation with the time wave had to do with the appearance of the stone. When the ampersand, we called it, or the stone. When the stone manifests, then history is going to end. So we had to construct this map of history, and identify the end state. Now, this is pretty wild stuff. And, I'd like to think that I'm fairly sane now, but at the time, we were participating in this delusional process.
One of the things that I remember, from some old Terence McKenna lecture is he used to say things like, entertain all ideas, but commit to none. And he used to say things like, I come to you with this stuff half finished. So he was very much into just entertaining all ideas and bringing them to people half baked, and just,
right.
He sort of just loved surfing the edge of knowledge, even if, the ideas didn't turn out to be, validated, or they didn't turn out to be true.
Right.
And, one of the things that's amazing is, if you go on YouTube or Google or whatever, and you just look up Terence McKenna lectures, there's hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of hours with stuff still coming out to this day, it seems. And he must have been on the road speaking all the time. And he was on the internet so early that,
right.
Well ahead of almost anyone else. Do you think that if he would have lived longer, he would have been like, one of the first big podcasters or something like that?
Oh, absolutely. I would say he was already, that was before we even had the word, to characterize it. But effectively, he was one of the first big podcasters of the world. The interesting thing about the internet is once this stuff is up there, it lives forever, and Terence has achieved this kind of virtual immortality. People can bring this stuff up and listen to his raps. And he was such a good rapper. He was so articulate, and he was so able to make this stuff seem plausible and present it so well. I used to kid him. I used to tell him, he never wanted me to. He was always uncomfortable if I would sit in on his public events when he was talking, because I was the only person that would stand up and say, well, wait a minute, what you just said was bullshit, and it directly contradicts what you said 20 minutes ago, which was also bullshit. And I didn't say it that unkindly, but I was the only person that really people seem, and I told him, it's not what you say, it's the way you say it. It's that voice, it's the way you deliver it. You could be reading the phone book.
Yeah.
People would hold on to every word because your delivery is so mesmerizing. That was his gift,
Yeah, he was almost like an intellectual stand-up comedian or something like that.
Something like that. Yeah.
It was just very artful the way that he spoke.
People have called him the thinking man's Timothy Leary. And in some ways he was. The ideas were great. And I think he reached a point, in his career where maybe he didn't take it that seriously, but he was having fun with it, and he was having fun presenting mind-stretching ideas, because it wasn't confined to this. You've listened probably to lots of his stuff, and he was very well read in all this esoteric stuff, magic, alchemy, shamanism, you name it, esoteric traditions, far more than I was, am. And he could bring all this stuff together, and he could come up with the craziest ideas and present them in a way that seemed convincing. And he didn't come off as a wild, raving maniac, which some people would have. He could present it very calmly, and it all seemed to make sense, And it was only later that people might reflect and say, well, wait a minute, what was he saying? This doesn't make any sense, So it's very interesting. Mm-hmm. I mean, in some ways, the premises of the whole time wave thing and the ingression of novelty, I agree with that. I mean, all you have to do is look around to see that things are getting weird, and they've been getting weird for a long time, and they're getting weirder and weirder and weirder. And you're reaching a point now where you could almost see like reality is fragmenting. We've got all these things. We've got the internet, we've got AI, we've got psychedelics, I mean, the world's pretty weird compared to 1971,
Yeah, it's certainly more heterogeneous. Like there's just more variety in every local slice of space around us. There's very few. It used to be like every small town was its own little cultural universe, but now, everything is injected everywhere from technology.
Yeah, it seems like it. So in that sense, I think Terence was right. I think that novelty does ingress into the continuum, and maybe we are headed towards some kind of singularity, whatever that might be. Mm-hmm. But people are talking about the singularity, and I think people think, that means something different to everybody. But the basic, I think the error, perhaps, not an error exactly, but Terence was attempting to quantify this, through the time wave, and actually nail down a moment, an instant where it all shifts over. And again, this goes back to our different perspectives. He was expecting some novel event to just collapse the whole quantum mm-hmm. wave. And I was, my argument was it doesn't work that way. Novelty is a real thing. It oozes into the continuum. It leaks into the continuum gradually. And then eventually you reach a point where you look around and you say, you know what? Things are just batshit weird around here. And that seems to be what's happening.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, when you were speaking earlier, a lot of these ideas are we'll just call them strange, or potentially even kooky. But, when you talk about something like the Philosopher's Stone, this object that can do anything, it's easy to dismiss that as just sort of this weird, medieval, thinking from alchemists who were people who didn't know all the things that we know today. But at the same time, it sounds remarkably similar to questions that very serious people talk about today around artificial general intelligence. Yes. And building technological artifacts that are literally capable of essentially doing anything. And, many serious people think that that's not only possible, but will happen within our lifetimes. Do you see any parallels between the things you and Terence were talking about and thinking and the current sort of race to create true artificial AI?
I do indeed, and I think that some of the ideas, or these ideas that Terence was talking about, and I was talking about too, but kind of from a different perspective. But I think a lot of Terence's ideas were the seed of these ideas that are emerging now, because people have listened to that stuff, and people with the skills in information science and artificial intelligence and all this resonates with people, and people, with the skills can say, well, yeah, we can create an artificial intelligence that is, we can, and it's what people have always done. It's, what humans are good at is visualizing something, imagining something. I mean, the imagination is what separates, I think, us as humans, us as human primates, from everybody else. The fact that we have an imagination, and the imagination, the word itself describes what it is: imagination. We're able to create internal representations of reality. And we create a reality hallucination, if you will. And we can then take those ideas and we can project them into the real world, because we have opposable thumbs, and we have the right tools. We can master technology, so somebody can imagine an artificial intelligence, which is made of data, basically. They can build that, and they're doing that. And it's actually quite terrifying, because these things are, any technology is a two-edged sword, and it can be, and everybody's terrified of artificial intelligence. Not everybody, but some people, and I wouldn't say I'm terrified of it, but I'm certainly wary of it. It's happening whether we're afraid of it or not.
Mm-hmm.
It's emerging. Very hard to know where it's going to go.
Another interesting McKennaism that stuck with me, that I think is one of the more interesting ideas that he had, or metaphors he used, was around what culture is. And he used to say things like, culture is not your friend, culture is your operating system. And so it's this metaphor of human culture being like an operating system, and the operating system is controlling what's not only what you think, but what's you could even potentially think. And so what was that idea, and where does it come from, and how do you interpret it?
I think the same thing. Social media. He was talking about social media and other things. I mean, the information sphere that we inhabit, the meme sphere, is culture. Now it's been instantiated in cyberspace, and the social media sphere is an example of this culture. I don't think you can escape from culture. I mean, you can't go live in a cave someplace. Some people can. Even there, they don't escape it. But if you live in this society, in this world, you're immersed in this cultural operating system. And now much of that has been uploaded into cyberspace in the form of the social media environments, and they're even, now, it was Facebook, and now they're talking about the metaverse and, augmented reality and all of this stuff. And so, that's what I mean when I say, in some sense, what he predicted is coming true. It's not coming true in the way that he predicted. I don't think it can be quantified, but his imagination, his visualization of what this might look like, we're seeing that in the embryonic stages right now. This is emerging in the embryonic stages. I mean, it's frightening and maybe encouraging, and also certainly astonishing how quickly all this new artificial intelligence technology is emerging and spreading.
version of this episode is available to paid subscribers at the Mind and Matter Substack at mindandmatter.substack.com. The full version is also freely available on my YouTube page. Just look up Mind and Matter or my name, Nick Jikomis, on YouTube, and you'll find the episode there. This is a partial version of the episode, and so it'll cut off partway through, but you'll still get a significant portion. So sign up to become a paid subscriber at Substack or visit my YouTube page to get the full episode.